Hey everyone, in this psychology revision video we're going to focus on the multi-store model and the serial position effect. So we're going to sort of recap the key things you need to know here. So that is obviously the multi-store model. You need to be able to describe it. We need to know the features of short-term memory and long-term memory, so like how much they can hold, how long they last, and how they code. And we need to know what the serial position effect is, and we need to know the research into that. And at the same time, the higher level end is obviously having the ability to evaluate the multi-store model. Is it a good theory of memory? Is it not good? That sort of thing. So let's get to it. So here is a diagram of the multi-store model of memory. So if you can remember from lessons, we have this nice sort of like 3-box layout describing how memory works, and those 3 boxes each stand for a different store or a different part of memory. So you've got the sensory store on the left, you've got the short-term memory store in the middle, and you've got the long-term memory store on the right there. So how this whole process works, any memory sort of always starts in the environment, whether it's you're hearing something or you're seeing something, and anything, any of your sensors that pick up information from the environment, all that information starts as a memory in the sensory store. Now, because we are constantly receiving those sensations 100% of the time, it never ends. Our brain is really good at just filtering out all of the stuff that's not important, and it ignores most of it. So that's why the majority, sort of like 95% of sensory memories, are immediately ignored, and that's why the whole process of the sensory store usually lasts less than 1 second. So it's filtering loads and loads of stuff that's not important and completely ignoring it. However, on that one occasion where you pay attention to something in the environment, maybe it's something that you're listening to, that you're watching, you pay attention to it, that will then allow that memory to become more than just a sensory memory, and it will access and move across into the short-term memory store. So when you pay attention to something in the environment, it moves from the sensory store into the short-term memory store. Now, when a memory makes it into the short-term memory store, again, it's only short, so it's going to last for about 18 to 30 seconds. If you start talking about something else, you'll forget that memory very quickly. Unless you start doing what we call maintenance rehearsals. That's repeating the memory in your head over and over again. The more you repeat a memory, the longer that memory is going to last. So if you repeat it over and over in your head, that short-term memory could last for a couple of minutes, for example. Now, if you want to create a long-term memory, what the multi-store model says you have to do is to keep that rehearsal process going, keep it going, and do it multiple times until we sort of reach this level of deep rehearsal. This deeper rehearsal, so that might be that you have to repeat it multiple days, multiple times, sort of like the process of revision, really. And the more that you repeat it, eventually a memory will then move across into the long-term memory store. And once it's made it to the long-term memory store, we know from psychological research that these memories can last forever. And we also know that you pretty much got an unlimited amount of space in your long-term memory. And once memories are in there, they're sort of just waiting to be, again, back to the flow of memory, to be retrieved. And when they get retrieved, they go back into the short-term memory store for a bit, because that's where they're being used. Memories that stay in the long-term memory store, if you don't use them for a long time, they may start to decay, which means gaps might start to appear in the memory. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the memory is still there in the long-term memory store. So what you need to be able to do in terms of the exam is explain this diagram, basically. On the next slide, I've got my slides wrong. On the next slide, I've got an explanation that you can have a little read of. So what we also need to be aware of is how each store works. So these are the key features of the memory stores, and we need to know how each memory store codes information. So that means, like, how does it process the information? We need to know the capacity, so how much can it fit in that memory store, and the duration, so how long does it last. So we've got the three stores, just like the diagram: the sensory memory, the short-term memory, and the long-term memory. So sensory memory codes, so that means it processes, it changes the information and processes it in a multi-sensory way. Well, that's just because your sensory memory is all five of your senses. So it processes it the way that that information is coming in. So if you're listening to something, it will be acoustic. If you're watching something, it will be visual. That's how it will be processed. Your sensory memory's got an unlimited capacity because it's constantly bringing information in, and your eyes themselves are bringing in billions and billions of information every second. But the duration, like we said, is less than a second. It's 250 milliseconds because your sensory memory constantly ignores lots of information and throws it away, basically. Right, the short-term memory store. How does it process information? Well, because we have to do a lot of rehearsal in the short-term memory store, it processes things based on sound. So acoustically is how it encodes information. Capacity-wise, the short-term memory can hold 7, give or take 2 chunks of information. It lasts for about 18 to 30 seconds unless you do maintenance rehearsal. Long-term memory store, it codes at a much deeper level, so it codes sort of like at the meaning of memories. So the word that we use there is semantically. Okay, it codes in a semantic way. Capacity is unlimited, so we know that you can have an unlimited number of memories, and it has a duration of forever. Memories can last forever there. So here is that answer that I was talking about. I won't read you through it, but if you want to have a look and a read of that, you can pause that and you can have a good look at there. That's a good example that I've written myself of how you can describe the multi-store model in an exam situation, how you could describe that diagram. So if you want to have a proper read of it, you can pause the video. Okay, so what you need to know to follow up the multi-store model is some research that sort of backs up the multi-store model, and the one on the GCSE specification is this one by Murdock, and it's about something called the serial position effect. Now, we would have done this in class, and every year it works. It's just brilliant. So what we do is we want to see what words from a list we actually remember. So what Murdock did is he gave participants a list of words and he presented them one at a time for about 2 seconds per word. It was anywhere between, you can use 20 to 40 words, it really doesn't matter. And then he just said, right, recall as many words as you can. Doesn't matter what order they record them in, just at the end of the list, right, go recall as many as you can. And basically what he did in his sort of like setup, he split the list into the beginning, the middle, and an end. And he counted how many words the participants could recall from each section. And what he found out, his results, were that the words at the end of the list and the start of the list were recalled really, really well. But the words in the middle were often forgotten. And this is basically just what we can conclude is that we remember the start and the end of a list, which supports the multi-store model. Why does it support the multi-store model? Well, because this serial position effect is what's happened. We've got the fact that people are recalling the beginning and the end. If we break this down into its 2 parts, you've got these 2 words. So you've got the serial position effect is made up of the primacy and the recency effect. So the primacy effect is that when you receive a list of information, you remember the beginning really well. And the recency effect is when you receive a list of information, you remember the end really, really well. So what tends to happen is this kind of effect. So you can see at the beginning, people recalled lots of the words, and then towards the middle, the recall was really poor. People tended to forget them. And then towards the end, recall went up really, really high. So people were really good at the beginning, really good at the end, really poor in the middle. And this supports the multi-store model. But like I said, that question is why? Well, if you think about the key things we know about the multi-store model and the key part that we're testing here. So if we give you a list of information to remember, we're really testing your short-term memory, and we're testing your ability to do rehearsal, because as soon as you start hearing words, we all know that we're all going to start repeating them in our heads. So we're testing some key parts of the multi-store model. And if I'm going to give you like 20 or 30 words, we know that you're going to get overwhelmed, because we know that you can only remember 7 pieces of information at one time in your short-term memory. And that's why we remember the beginning of the list, because as you start being given words, you start to rehearse them, your short-term memory is getting filled up. So we remember the beginning because it takes up our short-term memory, and by about words 6 or 7, people start to feel a little bit overwhelmed, and they kind of like give up and they can't really remember anymore. So because short-term memory gets filled up, we really remember that beginning, the part of the list, but then the middle gets ignored. We can't fit them in our short-term memory because we know we can only remember 7 items. So the middle gets forgotten. So what we start to do instead is we start to rehearse the beginning, and that makes sense. Our brain kind of goes, oh, I can't remember the middle, I'll just start rehearsing the words at the start. Now, because we start rehearsing those words over and over and over, we eventually get quite good rehearsal going on there. So we move those sort of beginning 6 or 7 words into our long-term memory. Now that means that that beginning of the list has moved into long-term, which means our short-term memory is empty again. So as the list is coming to an end, our short-term memory is freed up. So we've now got room for the final few words. So this serial position effect research supports the multi-store model in so many different ways. It supports the idea that we can only hold about 7 items in our short-term memory. It supports the idea that rehearsal will move memories into a long-term memory. And it also supports the idea that short-term memory is only sort of 18 to 30 seconds long, because we remember the words right at the end in the last sort of 20, 30 seconds. So the serial position effect is great support for the multi-store model. In terms of evaluating, what can we say in terms of evaluating the Murdock serial position effect study? Well, we'll just keep it really simple. I'll give you 1 positive and 1 negative. Again, it was a lab study, like a lot of memory tests, so we can comment on how highly controlled that process would be, incredibly standardized. So this means that it's replicable, which means lots of psychologists can repeat it. We can even repeat it in the classroom, and we get the same results every single time. So it's an incredibly reliable study. We can really trust these results. However, on the negatives, because it's a lab study, we can use that nice sort of easy evaluation of low ecological validity. We've just got to make sure we expand on that in our answers. So what does that mean? Well, it means it's an unnatural task. It's not very often. We just sit and listen and remember random lists of words. So you're going to get unnatural behaviour. This doesn't reflect the real world. So would people actually get these results in a real task, in a real situation? We don't know is the answer. So that's a potential problem to this piece of research. So the last thing you'd need to be able to do is to actually evaluate the multi-store model itself. So I've got 5 key evaluations you could have here. So it's always good to ask if a theory has any evidence. And as we know, the multi-store model does have lots of supporting evidence. So we have that serial position effect there, which is really handy. So it backs up the multi-store model and supports the ideas that it has. Is this theory useful for anyone? Well, the idea of rehearsal, making long-term memories, that's really useful for students who are preparing for exams. Really gives them and teachers a really good strategy to prepare for exams. So it's got really good applications to the real world, it's got real world value, you could say. The evidence that we talked about, is it useful? We could argue, we could counter how useful that evidence is, because it's very lab-based, so we can't really be sure if it's genuine behaviour. What does evidence from other people with amnesia tell us about long-term memory? And what do we know from our last video about long-term memories? Well, The multi-store model says you've got one square for long-term memory, but we know that there are three types of long-term memory, and we know that there are case studies and people who have damaged their long-term memory, but not all of their long-term memory. So that makes us think that the multi-store model is way too simple. It's far too simplistic because it says that we only have one long-term memory, but clearly long-term memory is more complicated than that. So you could say that the multi-store model makes long-term memory seem way too simple. And finally, the multi-store model says to make a long-term memory, we need to do rehearsal. But we know that there are certain memories that we never ever rehearse, yet we remember them incredibly well. And in lessons, we called them flashbulb memories. They're those memories that are so powerful and emotional that we don't even need to rehearse them. They just go straight, like they burn straight into our long-term memory. So lots of evaluations, good and bad things to say about the multi-store model. So that's the end of this video in terms of what we've covered. A little summary on the left here, the multi-store model to describe it, the key features of short-term and long-term memory, things like how long it lasts and how much you can hold. We've covered the serial position effect, and we've evaluated that study and the multi-store model. Good luck revising, and I'll see you in the next video.